Hello, everyone. My name is Philip Gregor. I'm from Frankfurt. I'll lead us through today's webinar, acting as a chair. But in just a minute, I will have the pleasure of introducing Mrs. Ikova from the Ministry of Trade of Industry for welcome and introduction. But before I do that, let me speak briefly about some technical and contextual issues. Well, first of all, we'll take questions and answers, but we'll take questions, but we'll answer them at the very end of the meeting. So whenever you have something to ask, you can click on the Q&A image or Q&A icon and record your question there. We'll try to answer as many questions as possible. We'll try to answer some questions in writing, but we might not be able to answer everything. So be happy to continue the conversation with you over the email. So please don't be shy. Ask any questions that pop up in your head now, and you can also do it later by email. The meeting is organized jointly by the Ministry of Trade and Industry and specifically the OECD National Contact Point Secretariat that the Ministry is hosting, and Frank Board. And it is kindly supported by the International Visegrad Fund. As well as you can see, the webinar will be in English as we have guests from abroad. So let me also thank you for joining despite the change of the date, change of the style, but also change of the content. Originally, we wanted to bring together the topic of the new OECD standards on responsible lending and the question of mandatory reporting for financial and non-financial corporates. But because we could not bring the person from Paris here, we've decided to be, let's say, laser focused on reporting. That being said, reporting, especially the regulation of sustainability reporting at the EU level, binds all these issues together. More than or about half of companies currently obliged to produce non-financial sustainability reports as part of the annual reports in the Czech Republic are actually banks and insurance companies, and also the financial corporates are the primary recipients from this information from companies themselves. So in the first half of the meeting, we'll address a little bit more the issue a little bit more from the, let's say, financial corporates perspective, and in the second half of the meeting, we'll deal with reporting directly, and that should be equally relevant for both, let's say, sides of this of this game. So finally, without further ado, let me hand the floor over to Mrs. Ikova. Mrs. Ikova, please.
Thank you, Mr. Gregor. Good morning, everybody. And thank you again for joining us this morning for this webinar on sustainable reporting in the European Union. My name is Ludmila Hiklova, and as Mr. Gregor said, I work for the Ministry of Trade and Industry, and at the same time, I am part of the Secretariat for the National Contact Points for the OECD Guideline for Multinational Enterprises. Our original idea was to have a seminar covering more in detail both topics, especially the due diligence for responsible corporate lending and securities underwriting. For that, we have invited special guests from the OECD Secretariat. However, with the change of the situation, we had to change our plans as well. But we count to hold this seminar a little bit later, probably in September, October, as a face-to-face workshop or the meeting. So you will be informed well in advance. But still, I'm very lucky that we could organize this webinar with slightly different agenda, but a very important agenda on the recent trends in reporting and the EU coming standards. And at this point, I would like to especially extend my thanks to Mrs. Vejvodová, who took over the organization of the webinar, all the activities related to that, and made it possible this webinar to happen. So what will happen today? We have invited 4 speakers, and we start with the topic related to the NCP, National Contact Point, OECD Guidelines, at the view of the OECD on the sustainable reporting and due diligence and stuff like this. Then we will have Mr. Michael Zimoni, who is Policy and External Affairs Director at CDSB and has a rich experience in advisory and green financing. And then will follow Mrs. Kristina Vejvodova, who is a lawyer and a CE research coordinator at the Frank Bolt, who will share with us the view and the current status of sustainability reporting in the EU and Visegrad region. Then we will have a short session on the recommendations and reflections on the companies from the 4 panelists. And the last but not least, Mr. Gregor, who is head of responsible company section at the Frank Bolt, has a profound experience with EU policies and long-term experience with EU policies and sustainable reporting, will tell us what are the European Commission plans for the expansion of the scope of the EU non-financial reporting directive. So this is in a brief the agenda, and at the end we will have a Q&A session, so please feel free to send your questions or raise them later on. We will answer them at the end of the seminar. So without further delay, we move to the first topic, which is the role of the national contact points in the reporting and the responsible corporate behavior. And what I will speak about first, briefly about just show my experience, which is not related only to the government and Ministry of Trade. Most of my last 20 years careers I spent in the private sector, working for the multinational enterprises here in Czech Republic, and as well 10 years in China. So this gives me a little bit different perspective from only the government, the regulator ones. And I will somehow try to reflect it as well in these slides. So if we can move forward to the first point, when we are speaking about the OECD guidelines, so what is the relationship to the EU reporting and the EU legislation? So I start a little bit back in late of 70s, because the sustainable reporting and the regulation of the responsible business conduct is not only 10, 20 years past 20 years issue. It goes really, really back. And one of the first activities on this field was exactly the OECD Guideline for Multinational Enterprises in 1976, followed 1 year later by ILO tripartite declaration for the multinational enterprises and social policy. Why I'm mentioning ILO at this point is, firstly, because rights, labor rights and employment conditions are one of the core aims of the responsible business conduct, together with the human rights and environment, of course. And these 3 organizations, ILO, OECD, in EU, they cooperate very closely, not only on the technical assistance, especially in the past years. They have projects in Latin America, they have projects in East Asia, when they try to promote responsible business conduct, especially in a view to supply chains. But this cooperation is reflected as well in the standards and legislation activities. So, for example, latest, well, not that latest, but if we speak about the European Union and the relationship, external relationship with the third countries, when they conclude free trade agreements, they incorporated sections or the provisions making reference to the international labor conventions into the free trade agreements, and as well mentioning the sustainable development and reflecting kind of the due diligence and OECD standards. So this is the one way. And in this way, they are trying to, I cannot say push, it depends, of course, on the leverage which they have. The countries like Vietnam and China, well, we'll see with what success, to adhere to these standards. And one of the core words in this, which is reflected in the legislation, EU legislation, is the due diligence, and it's the original word of the OECD Guideline. And I will come a few slides later. What exactly means the due diligence in the view of the OECD? And on the next slide, we will see where the EU legislation has directly got inspired by the OECD guidelines or the special guidances, sectoral guidances, because the OECD has decided to select several special sectors which are more vulnerable they encompass more risk for the society and for the environment, and prepare special guidances for the companies active in those industries. So one of them is a conflict minerals. Originally it was a conflict mineral guidance and supply chains, and it was then turned into the EU legislation, EU regulation on the conflict minerals. And similar things, well, in a slightly different way, is happening with the non-financial reporting directive, which you will hear a little bit later definitely from Mr. Gregor. So when we come to the next slide, very briefly, what is the OECD guidelines about? I mean, all the information you can find on the website are the OECD responsible business conduct or our national contact points. But the guidelines is not a hard law, it's the soft law. There are recommendations which are addressed to the multinational enterprises from the part of the government, and the multinational enterprises at home, the home countries, but as well abroad, having some activities or the business partners abroad. So these are voluntary principles covering human rights, transparency, environment, employment and labor, and same as the anti-corruption, supporting consumer interest and development of the science and technology, and fair competition and taxation. It's not only the view of the governments or the OECD Secretariat, it incorporates as well the view of the stakeholders, which are the business associations, labor unions, and NGOs. So on the next slide, and this is very particular to the OECD guidelines. They are equipped with very unique mechanism of promoting, and as well the non-judicial grievance mechanism. That means that, let's say, third parties, NGOs, trade unions, they can place a complaint to the national contact points when they have a substantial doubt, or when they think that company, and does not need to be only the multinational company, it can be even a small, medium-sized company, does not adhere to the principles of the guidelines. Each of the state, each of the government who adhere to the guidelines, OECD guidelines, has to establish one such point. And in Czech Republic, and now we will see the structure of the Czech Republic NCP on the next slide. It was NCP established, we can move to the next slide, in 2013, and it consists of it has a quadripartite structure. Representatives of the governments, representative of the employers, employees, and non-governmental sector, and you see that it's represented by Frank Bolt in our NCP. At the moment, Czech NCP is dealing with only one case, but this is, let's say, quite exceptional, because countries like UK, France, Netherlands, they have yearly many complaints from the trade unions and NGOs towards the big national companies across the sectors, and they have to deal with that. So it's not quite unique. So what are the RBC principles? I have to watch a little bit of time. So what are the RBC principles about? First of all, do not cause adverse impact. It reflects directly to the activity of the company. Second level is do not substantially contribute. Third level is if you have business partners, you try to mitigate that risk and your business partners. And the fourth level, which is the last one, is that you try to work with your business partners and to educate them and use your leverage so they apply these principles. On the next slide, we see, and this is the core of the due diligence. It is a five steps process, which is in a circle. The first one is, and you have to have some strategy or policy within the company. Then that follows that based on this strategy, you identify, assess your risks across your company activities, but as well the supply chains and other relationship. You, based on the risks, on the most severe ones, you do some prioritization, and you try to cease, prevent, or mitigate these impacts. Then regularly you track, and most importantly, and this is when we're coming to the report, you communicate and you report publicly how those adverse or potentially adverse impacts were addressed. Sometimes this 5 steps has more steps, which is a 6th one, is a remedy, which is a very questionable now. And if you are interested in that, in June, OECD will have a global forum related specifically on this topic. Now a few slides about the financing. A couple of years ago, OECD Secretariat has decided to put together 3 guidances specifically on the finance sector, and having in mind the force of the finance, and then the finance goes across all the sectors and the influence. At the same time, the finance covers, or the activities in the finance sector can reach to all main chapters of the sustainable or the responsible behavior, human rights, employment, environment, and consumer. We move to the next one. And they tried to help the finance industry with the guidance, because they were aware about the complex business relationship which finance activities encompass. And nonetheless, as well, in the past 5-6 years, there was an increase in complaints, especially towards the financial institutions. So it means that the NCPs has received many complaints from the trade unions, other companies, or the trade unions for the not adhering by the multinationals to the principles of the guidance. So what they have prepared was, in 2017, they put together a small brochure, Responsible Business Conduct for Institutional Investors, Key Considerations for the Due Diligence. And maybe some of you have participated 2 years ago in the seminar we held at the Ministry of Trade related to the topic. Secondly, they put together the corporate lending. It's on the next slide. Corporate lending and securities underwriting guidance. And this was meant to be one of the topics for the today, but we will keep it for the workshop in September or in October. But the main point of it is to keep the due diligence, or to focus due diligence not only on the activities of the companies themselves, the companies who are recipient of the funds, but it is expected that there will be more questions related to their supply chains and responsible business behavior in those supply chains. So this is very, very briefly and very quickly everything what I wanted to say today. The most important was just to give you the idea that something like this exists, that you can visit our websites, you can contact me for further questions, and well, I look forward to your question. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mrs. Ikova. Before I hand over to Mike Zimoni, who's the Policy and External Affairs Director at the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, let me just say that for the financial corporates to do what the OECD expects them to do and what the EU is increasingly regulating or forcing them to do by regulation, well, they need information from companies, from investee companies, from the recipients of the loans and so on and so forth. So this is what puts the reporting agenda at the center of this emerging framework. But I suppose this is something that we will learn about in the next presentation. So Mr. Zimoni, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to speak with you today, and thank you very much for inviting me to this webinar. I'm very excited to be participating. Today, I wanted to, as Mr. Gregor has alluded to, I wanted to set the scene for his presentation, really, if I may, about why reporting is such an important element of a sustainable financial system and a resilient financial system, and try to change some of your perceptions, hopefully, on the reasoning behind why reporting is so important, not purely for sort of a CSR or goodwill perspective, but really it is, as Mr. Gregor said, at the heart of financial decision making. So if I may, I will just quickly introduce CDSB, the Climate Disclosure Standards Board. We are a consortium of 9 business and environmental NGOs, which you can see on the screen. And we are supported by a technical working group of about 40 experts globally. And really our mission is to provide decision useful environmental, including climate change, information to financial markets via the mainstream corporate report, that is the annual reports of companies. And on the next slide, you can see that the main vehicle for this is the CDSB framework, which we produce as a technical guidance that helps you with how to incorporate such information into your annual report. It has 7 principles and 12 requirements. The principles really help you make the linkages with financial reporting practices, as well as improve the quality of the information you report, and the requirements really focus on the content. And I also would like to highlight the fact that one of the key influencers of the CDSB framework were actually the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises. It's a part and parcel of course, of reporting on these matters. So with that very short introduction to CDSB, I'd like to give a bit more context on Europe, but also globally. So as some of you might be aware, Europe, the EU has been moving quite quickly on making sustainable finance normal across the Union. And this really has accelerated back in March of 2018, when the EU has published the Sustainable Finance Action Plan, which has really 3 objectives: to reorient capital flows towards sustainable investments, to mainstream sustainability into risk management, and to foster transparency and long-termism in order to create resilient and hopefully prosperous markets across Europe. Now, there are quite a few elements of this Sustainable Finance Action Plan, which I will not go through, but I just wanted to highlight 3 elements really. One is the development of a sustainability taxonomy, which is a system to categorize activities that are in terms of whether they are green or not. The current version of the taxonomy, which is almost across the line, is focusing on green activities, and of course there are discussions about whether there should be other extensions to that relating to social elements and brown activities, so to speak, so less sustainable activities. And based on that, there is also a disclosure regulation for investors, which really asks investors to talk about the compliance of their investments to the criteria of this taxonomy. Related to this is what was already mentioned, of course, the non-financial reporting directive, which some of you might be familiar with, some of you might be already complying with, or working to comply with, which really relates to companies, large companies, and some other public interest entities reporting on certain matters. But Mr. Gregor will cover that, so I will not talk about that too much. And back in December of 2019, on top of the Sustainable Finance Action Plan, the Commission has also published its renewed Green Deal, which is really the first internationally to put forward such a comprehensive set of plans to really revamp the European financial system. Some elements that are relevant to the discussion are, for example, the climate law, which will enshrine a 2050 climate neutrality target across the Union, which will, of course, have a significant and profound impact to the way business happens in Europe, but also directives related to energy efficiency, energy tax, carbon border adjustments, and even the emissions trading system. So we are really seeing a tightening and much more stringent move towards a low carbon sustainable future in Europe from a strong policy perspective. And on the next slide, what I wanted to talk to you about is what is the motivation behind this? There is, of course, a motivation as the EU, obviously, as a responsibility toward its citizens to create a prosperous future for them and a healthy future for them. But this is one element. Another element to think about is that sustainability risks are financial risks. In the case of this diagram that you can see in front of you, I'm focusing on climate. This is a diagram from the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which I'll mention this in a moment. But the important point to think about is that these policy changes that I mentioned will have a significant financial impact on some businesses if they do not adapt and they do not move on. So it will have these new rules of the game, so to speak, will have an impact on their income, on their balance sheet, on their cash flows and revenues and expenditures, and really the cost of capital that they might get from their investors, both from the policy side, but also from physical changes that might be happening that might create disturbances in their operations. So really on the next slide, I wanted to highlight a quote from the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which is a G20 initiative set up by the Financial Stability Board, sort of a group of central banks focusing on revamping the financial system after the 2008 financial crisis. This is all about making sure that risks are priced correctly, that capital is allocated correctly, and make sure that we have a financial system that is stable and is prosperous and is managing risks. So this Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, what is this? This is an initiative, as I said, that came from the G20, from central bankers, not environmentalists, and it was chaired by the governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, and it was really an initiative by the market for the market to develop recommendations on how to integrate climate-related financial information into mainstream reports, that is, annual reports. It is voluntary for now, although we're already seeing some mandatory push internationally in the EU in particular, but also in Canada and Australia and elsewhere, and New Zealand. But really it is a way to focus in on what are the financial risks related to climate change. And there are, of course, also discussions around this approach of financial risk coming from climate can also be translated into other sustainability risks, be that wider environmental risks or other governance or other issues. And the important thing to think about, which is on my next slide, is that we also see the market reacting to this. So if you're an organization, if you're a listed company, you will probably have one or two or maybe all of the institutional investors invested in you as universal owners, really owning shares in most, if not all, companies globally that are listed. the market and the big players are reacting to this because they see that these ESG risks are financial risks that will impact their bottom line, and they have a duty of care to their customers and to their pension holders and investees to manage this risk. So they are acting quickly, but governments are acting quickly as well. And an example I would like to bring up, which is actually from this week, from the 11th, is Canada's response to the sort of bailouts in response to COVID-19. And Justin Trudeau, Prime Minister of Canada, has made an announcement outlining its package of bailout conditions and sizes, and actually, beyond requirements to, of course, making sure that the recipients of these funds aren't avoiding taxes, etc. They have actually included a specific requirement that companies receiving these funds report in line with the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which I just mentioned. So as we are hopefully coming towards the recovery point of this crisis, there is a strong push from governments to make sure that this is a fair and also a sustainable recovery that really makes changes into the way the financial system operates. So moving on back to the European context, and again, Mr. Gregor will talk a bit more about what's happening here. But I just wanted to highlight that there is, of course, a requirement in Europe to report on non-financial matters, but it is clear that they are not yet sufficient to elicit the information that the market needs. So this is actually a quote from the European Commission's impact assessment on the revision of this directive, and they are, even the Commission, who was the author really of this directive, sees that information is not comparable or reliable. There are issues with trust. It is clear that companies don't report all the information that users might need. Some companies do not report information at all, and that's of course a serious issue. And as a result, it's hard for investors and other users to find information they need to make financial decisions. And it is clear that they are interested in this information. So moving on to the next slide, I wanted to talk about, obviously this is a webinar in the context of the Visegrad region. So I wanted to talk, perhaps think about what could this mean for the region. And we might think that we are perhaps a smaller economy than others, and that we might not be captured by some of these sort of cutting edge developments just yet. But the reality is that policy pressure is happening in the EU, and the EU is leading, and of course the Visegrad region is very much part of the EU, and also internationally. And in an international market, it is no longer an option to not take account of these developments, because that will impact our bottom line. Also, if there are any smaller businesses that are in the supply chains of larger companies, these larger companies will be covered by these requirements, and they will be coming to you to ask for information that they might need to report as a result of these requirements. And the Commission, just on Tuesday actually as well, there was a call where they have also highlighted the fact that they are really focusing in on risks down the supply chain of companies as part of the non-financial reporting directive. And there is also, as part of this revision, of course, a direction towards higher requirements, and supervision of companies is also a key element of this revision, with the European Securities and Markets Authority moving forward on this, although of course they could move far faster, but they are making some good signals. So this is coming, and this is something that will affect every single business globally, including the Visegrad region. But this is also an opportunity for you, because if you are part of the solution, that means that you are a less risky investment, or if you are investing in companies that are part of the solution, you are decreasing your risk related to your investment. So this can result in a lower cost of capital. It can also make sure that you get the right investors in your business so that you have long-term investment that is really aligned with the objectives of the organizations. And last but not least, in this competitive world, especially as we come to tough times ahead as part of this recovery, you will have a competitive advantage to your peers if you are thinking more long-term and thinking more resilience. So with that, one thing I wanted to say is, as CDSB, a lot of the work we do is also to support businesses on this journey. So I just wanted to offer, send out an open offer. We're here to support you. We're here to help you implement these requirements. And the best part of it is that all of our work is on this in Europe is funded by the EU Life program. So this is free of charge. We are just here because this is our mission, and we want to support businesses to get better information to their investors in line with the upcoming requirements. So with that, I will leave it here and hand it back to Mr. Greber. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. If anyone has any questions, whether for Mrs. Hiklova or Mr. Zimoni, please do write them down in the Q&A by clicking on the Q&A button. There was a couple of things in your presentation, Mr. Zimoni. One was about the EU and Financial Reporting Directive, and we'll address that later in terms of what is coming, how fast is the reform coming, and what it will mean for Czech companies in particular. And there was another point I want to quickly comment on, and that's this finding of the European Commission that the current reporting on sustainability matters is completely inadequate is partly based on our research that my colleague Kristina Vejvodová will present just in a minute, as well as on the CDSB's research and a couple of other sources. But essentially, every research in the space points to the same conclusion. So let's now take a look at what is the situation in the Czech Republic, in the broader Visegrad region. How does that compare to the EU? And we will follow the discussion with some implications and recommendations for companies. Christina, if I may, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Philip, for the introduction, and good morning, everyone. Today, I'm going to present the results of the research project that was implemented by the Alliance for Corporate Transparency, or ACT, on non-financial disclosures in the European Union. Together with our partners, whose logos you can see on this slide, no, on the slide before, Comenius University in Bratislava, Faculty of Law, and Hungarian Environmental Management and Law Association, we've taken data that resulted from the ACT analysis, and we've done a cross-regional analysis. So we compare the results in Visegrad region with the results in the rest of Europe. And this will be the main scope of my presentation today. As you can see on the next slide, the original ACT research was managed by Frank Bolt in collaboration with Sustancia. And of course, a lot of other content and advisory partners whose logos you can see were included in the project as well. Those are also member organizations of the Alliance. In order to give you a general idea on the extensiveness of the research, I would like to mention that the non-financial statements of analyzed companies were assessed for hundreds of criteria. And actually, my personal opinion as one of the analysts who were working on this analysis is that it was probably more than 1,000. The results are available online on the link you can see, and you can find there the ACT research report and a database with full results. Next slide, please. Criteria for this analysis are framed by the requirements under the Non-Financial Reporting Directive and are also based on already existing frameworks and reporting standards, because the criteria mentioned in the directive itself are not very specific. So you probably are aware that since 2018, certain entities are obliged to publish non-financial statements pursuant to this directive. Those are large public interest companies with more than 500 employees and with revenue over 40 million euro. According to the directive, these companies should provide information on their business model, policies and outcome of these policies, risks and KPIs. This information should be provided for topics you can see listed here. It ranges from climate change and other environmental issues to anti-corruption and anti-bribery matters. And companies should be reporting on these topics if these topics are material for them. Philip will tell you more about materiality a bit later, but in a summary, that means where company is facing risks, such as financial risks, Mike Zimone was actually talking about today, or has actual impacts, and those can be either positive or adverse. The company should be reporting on these issues. For example, finance companies should reflect their exposures in high carbon and other high risk sectors. As you can see on the next slide, overall 1,000 companies were included in the ACT analysis, and 95 of those companies were from Visegrad region. You can definitely notice that Poland is very dominant in this selection, and that's simply because the Warsaw Stock Exchange hosts many large companies. In the Czech Republic, we've included 5 finance companies. Those are namely Airbank, Česká spořitelna, Equabank, Komerční banka, and Moneta Money Bank, and 5 companies from other sectors, ČEZ, Energetický a průmyslový holding, Kofola, O2 Czech Republic, and Škoda. Before we proceed on the next slide, I would like to mention that it was nice to see how many representatives of those companies registered for this webinar and are joining us today. So on the next slide, you can see the first results of the research we will be presenting today. As you can see, climate-related policies are reported less often in the Czech Republic than in the rest of Europe. This gap actually gets even larger in case of outcomes of those policies. This is actually the case of all Visegrad countries. For example, in Poland, less than 1/2 of the companies is reporting on any climate-related policies, and less than 20% on any outcomes. These numbers get even lower in cases of Slovakia and Hungary. You can also notice that specific disclosures on policies and or on outcomes are very rare. When it comes to other environmental topics such as biodiversity, the general criteria on policies, risks, and outcomes are disclosed even less frequently, but we will not show you any slides of those environmental topics today. On the next slide, you can see how often are companies reporting on positive impacts of their products and services, such as energy companies reporting on renewables. But of course, these positive impacts can be related to other topics than climate change. For example, pharmaceutical companies producing medicines for neglected diseases have positive social impact. These numbers are very low throughout the whole Europe. So that's quite surprising because actually, according to the European Union taxonomy, this kind of reporting will become mandatory by the end of the next year. On the next slide, we include information on climate targets. You can again notice a large gap between Visegrad and European companies. There are actually only 4 companies from Visegrad region that are reporting on climate targets. 1 company is from the Czech Republic, 1 is from Hungary, and 2 are from Poland. Only 1 of those companies is from the energy sector, and there is actually no financial company in the Visegrad region reporting on climate targets, which is quite surprising again for sectors that are significantly contributing to climate change. When it comes to more specific issues regarding climate-related risks, we have them on the next slide. Yes, thank you. You can see that the numbers are still very low. The only little exception is organization strategy to manage the identified risks and impacts. The results are slightly better over there, and that is simply because it's more general question than the others. And actually 8 companies in the Visegrad region reported on this issue. 5 of those are from Poland, 2 from Hungary, and only 1 from the Czech Republic. Slovakia actually isn't reporting any specific issues relating climate matters at all. On the next slide, we get to a different topic of employee matters. Policies related to employee matters are disclosed much more often than other policies. You can see that in case of the Czech Republic, every Czech company disclosed either vague or specific policy. But in comparison with the rest of Europe, there is a much larger gap between companies reporting on policies and disclosing outcomes of those policies. This again confirms that absolute majority of these disclosures is not providing sufficient details. Next slide, please. With exception for gender diversity and gender pay gap, aggregated KPIs for employee matters are reported more frequently by Visegrad countries than in other European regions. But in case of the Czech Republic, the results are slightly worse than in other Visegrad countries. For example, only 40% of companies report on gender diversity, and actually no company is disclosing any data on pay difference between women and men. And just a side note, you can see that we recorded such data only if they were provided for broken down by job category. That means at least separately for management and for other workers. Next slide, please. We are getting to human rights here. You can see that the numbers are declining again, especially in the Czech Republic. As you can see, only 5 Czech companies publish any human rights policies, and all of them have only vague character. And only 2 companies then describe outcomes related to those policies. In other Visegrad countries, only Poland is better. 3/4 of Polish companies are disclosing HR policies. However, reporting on policy outcomes is pretty much the same as in the case of the Czech Republic. Next slide, please. Key finding regarding human rights risks is the disparity you can see between companies identifying any human rights risks and companies reporting on what they do about such risks beyond any general commitments. That is the due diligence process. And I would like to emphasize here that we did not judge the quality of the due diligence process. We just assessed key elements of the process if they were indicated or not. In the Czech Republic, the numbers are under both the European and the Visegrad average. Only 30% of Czech companies are reporting on any human rights risks. On the next slide, you can see a summary of key findings that are actually applicable to both the European region in general and the Visegrad region. The first point represents key performance indicators in summarized statements or tables. As you can surely imagine, it is hard to find relevant data when KPIs are scattered throughout reports. Plus, this number, it doesn't really mean that, or necessarily mean that all of those KPIs are relevant for the organization's nature. So it doesn't necessarily mean that all this information is relevant. Also, this number is very interesting for comparison of the quality of non-financial statements published by companies with their financial statements. The second number is something you could see during the whole presentation. The majority of the disclosures is just vague, and actually any specific and relevant information on outcomes or other specific issues are described just very rarely. The third point shows us the gap between European and Visegrad companies reporting on climate-related targets, which is quite striking because Visegrad companies are not providing sufficient information on this topic, not only to general readers, but also to investors interested in sustainable investments. And the most important finding in the area of human rights is the very low reporting on due diligence process, which is actually specifically mentioned requirement under the directive. So that's even more surprising because of that. Here, I would also like to mention that we've created a report with comparison of the results of the ACT analysis and the Visegrad region. And we will send it, we will include it in our follow-up email to this webinar, and you will receive it probably next week. And my last slide is about research we are going to do this year. We were thinking that it doesn't make much sense to repeat the same extensive research we've done last year because the regulation hasn't really changed and the requirements under the directive stayed pretty much the same. So we believe that we would get almost the same results as we did last year. We therefore decided that we will focus more on climate change and on other environmental issues. And we will do the analysis in the European regions that are not very advanced in reporting. And it is not only the Visegrad region, but also the whole Central, Southern, and Eastern Europe. So we will analyze 300 companies from these regions, and we will be focusing on sectors that significantly contribute to climate change, that is energy and finance, for example. And we plan to publish the results in October this year, and we will organize several events where we will present the results in different European countries, of course, if the situation will allow us to do so. So this is all from me for now. Feel free to ask any questions, either me or Philip Gregor, who was actually a coordinator of the ACT analysis research, will be happy to answer. So thank you very much for your attention, and back to Philip.
Thank you, Christina. I suppose that the biggest finding of our research is that there's generally a lack of specificity and key information. It's not a problem that companies don't report on the issues. It's just that it's mostly a boilerplate disclosure, which really serves no purpose from the excuse me, from the perspective of the legislation. This will become problematic as the legislation will be strengthened, and so will be the enforcement. So that's really the motivation behind our research, to point out what's inadequate and how that can be improved. And this is of course difficult for people from corporates, as this agenda naturally appears alien and difficult to deal with. But luckily, it is not all that bleak. There is good guidance out there. The first steps can be actually quite small and not too burdensome, and yet have quite meaningful results. And one of those results can be that the reports can be actually quite short. So I will now offer some very light touch recommendations, just really a framing recommendations for those who are engaging in as preparers of the reports. And I will ask Mr. Zimony and Mrs. Iklova for their reflections and their own recommendations to companies. After the webinar, we will share with you a detailed template guide, that can guide you through the process of reporting step by step, with a lot of examples and concrete recommendations, what needs to be disclosed under certain areas and under what conditions, because it's not that every company should disclose every possible information. It's all about selection and identifying information that matters, that is material. But for now, let's just focus on the principles. So first of all, where to start? I mean, any complex problem becomes much easier if you look at it from the right perspective. So first of all, do take a look at the non-financial reporting directive and the guidelines that the European Commission have developed around them, especially in climate. They are very good and they explain so much. So just there are a lot of answers directly in the legislation. Secondly, if you are from the finance sector, you're supposed to report on your investment and lending policies, not on how much paper you consume in your offices or how much scope 1, scope 2 emission you consume, again, in connection with your office work. Now, if you face risks in your value chains, and this is again the case of the finance sector and their investment and lending activities, as well as the companies that rely on extensive supply chains or completely outsourced production, then the OECD due diligence guidance will give you an idea what are the key issues or how can you actually start doing this properly? What are the key issues you should be reporting on, and so on and so forth. The OECD has developed such guidances not only for the finance sector, but also on the issue of conflict minerals, which may be relevant for the automotive industry in the Czech Republic, as well as on the agricultural supply chains, as well as on the supply chains in the garment sector. On the agricultural supply chains, one would think that may not be so relevant for the Czech Republic, but it happened so that I guess one of the most booming companies of these days, Rohlik, the online supermarket, has issued bonds on the Prague Stock Exchange. So in the next couple of years, they might come actually under the scope of the legislation. And when it comes to the climate, in addition to the great guidance that can be provided by the CDSB, let me just repeat what Mike Zimon said about the task force on climate-related financial disclosures. This is becoming not only de facto standard, but very rapidly the US standard for climate reporting. So any company, any manufacturing company with high emissions or high energy needs, any energy producing company, as well as any company from the finance sector, which is connected through all these risks through their investments, should really take a look into these issues when considering what is it that they are expected to report on climate. And finally, Christina presented some numbers on sustainable activities. Just to put it in the context, almost any company report does include information on philanthropy or on some good things that they do, or even on products and services that have some positive environmental and social impact. But what really matters, and that's the reason for such a low numbers, what really matters is the disclosure on the economic numbers surrounding these activities, that is turnover and capital expenditures. And this doesn't come from our heads. This is the basis of the EU taxonomy regulation, which will kick in next year, and which will first require investors and later and simultaneously companies to report on exactly these numbers on activities that correspond to the taxonomy regulation. So if you want to report on your sustainable activities, and you may choose not to, but if you want to report on it, these are the concrete figures that are expected to be in your report. Can we move to the next slide, please, now? With regard to the actual content, I'll stay very brief because I could not do justice. We'll do it. We'll send you a detailed information afterwards. But I wanted to bring up these 3 points that you see on the slides. And one is that reports should contain material information. That means risks facing companies, real risks facing companies related to sustainability issues such as climate in the first place, as well as key impacts. It's not so important to report on compliance measures and so on and so forth. You probably need to say something about your policies in that regard, but really the focus should be on the risks and impacts. That's what this is all about. Secondly, with regard to those risks and impacts, you're expected to provide information on the management of those issues, any targets set in terms of reducing those impacts or risks, and the performance against those targets. And this is really missing from the reports. Companies are apt at disclosing policies and commitments, but not really what's actually happening, with exceptions, of course. And finally, if you think about it, then from the perspective of content style and perspective, these are the metrics that should be ideally included in the annual management report. This should be linked to the questions of business model and governance and strategic planning. So this is where it belongs. Which brings me to our last slide on the recommendations, and that is the don'ts. And one common mistake that we see, that companies are reporting just on the basis of some reporting framework, most commonly global reporting initiative standards, but that doesn't itself, cut it. It's not about these standards or frameworks are really useful in identifying relevant information that could be material for the company, but what exactly needs to be reported is another question that needs to be really decided by the company itself on the basis of the legislation. Secondly, don't do CSR reports. I mean, we can get into a discussion what it means, but think about the audience and think about the information. If you don't have an audience in terms of of investors or banks interested in this information who provide you with loans, then think about the management and governance bodies of the company as the primary recipients of the information. I mean, not everything that's get discussed inside of the company needs to make it into the report, but the report should be an outcome of that internal process. So, and usually CSR stuff or CSR reports are not being discussed in these circles, I would assume. And finally, all of this may be a little bit intimidating, but it's perfectly fine to start simple, but from the right angle. And if it makes sense for the company and for its stakeholders, it will grow, and it will grow from on the healthy basis. So these have been very, very high level recommendations. We realized that let me repeat for the third time. We will get you the real recommendation, detailed recommendations later on, but that's quite a lot of pages that we could not really present here. I'll stop there with my remarks, because I want to ask Mrs. Hikova and Mr. Zimoni what they think both about the current situation in terms of the state of the reporting, as well as their recommendations for companies. What actually how can they actually overcome some of these problems? And let me start with Mrs. Hikova. What's your take on this from the perspective of let's say of the overseer of the OECD matters in the Czech Republic?
Yeah, thank you. First, I would like to congratulate you. Thanks for the enormous work you and your colleagues have done. I mean, it's really amazing to review reports of 1,000 companies, and definitely, I mean, the regulators and the EU will benefit from it. So thanks again. If you are asking me about the recommendations, I mean, it's cliche, but it's always so that everything starts with people, and in case of the companies, with the top management. So you will have to have involve in the, well, not direct reporting, but in the agenda, people from the board, and they have to take it seriously. Second recommendation, and you have mentioned it already, are the KPIs. It's important to measure the performance and to have a set of cannot say precise, but measurable performance targets. And thirdly, it comes as well that if you give the responsibility, you have to give to people who are dealing with the RBC as well sufficient tools, yeah, to be equipped with and to work well. And from the OECD point, I cannot not mention due diligence. This is the cornerstone, the beginning of the reporting. And I would go back to the, well, not visually, just to remind you about the due diligence 5 steps, and it's in the circle. Yeah, it never ends. It goes again, and making the process and the targets and the assessment better and better. So that's few of recommendations which I would like to share.
Yeah, I was just checking whether I'm not muted. Thank you very much for this. I suppose all of these issues are kind of a chicken or the egg problem, such as your recommendation how to equip the people responsible for these issues in the company with sufficient tools and mandate and powers from the board, while the reporting should be a little bit about the board. So that's one of the things that perhaps we can discuss later. But now, Mr. Zimoli, what's your take on all of this, on the situation? But also, would you have any practical advice to companies where they can start, or what is it that they should really focus on in the beginning?
Sure, and I would also like to agree with Mr. Kloba. I think it's really important to have the actual evidence of what is happening right now, and this research really helps us to see where the Visegrad region stands in comparison to Europe, and also where specifically there are shortcomings. And I don't think it's too far to go that we are behind the rest of Europe, and we need to catch up. So this is hopefully a stark bit of evidence to show that we need to do more, and I think we can do more. I really liked the recommendations you have outlined, and I think it also comes back to the fact that we need to think about, as a reporting organization, why am I reporting this? Yes, it is a requirement, and the requirements are evolving, but it is also a way to communicate and to get a response, and to, you know, maintain those investor relationships, you know, or if there's another reason why you're reporting, to achieve those objectives, and keep that in mind as you go through the process. And in that way, you use the, you know, the requirements and the various standards, and as one of the standards that is, I agree, don't blindly follow the standards, use them to achieve your objectives, and think about what is it that you want to convey to your audience. So one of the questions we get, and actually one of the ones that I was asked in this way, if I look at my businesses and I realize that my risks are so severe that I will go bankrupt, should I report it? It's a funny question, but I like it because it really shows that sometimes businesses get stuck at one stage, and these different elements and these different requirements are not just tick boxes that you do. They are there to tell you the story. So you recognize a risk. Of course, you know, you don't want to disclose a risk if it shows that you are a weaker or a riskier investment. But if you take that risk and you say, okay, this is a risk. In my sector, probably I'm not the only one faced with the risk, because we all are, you know, in the same business. But what I can do is I can think about what are the processes and systems I can implement to manage and overcome those risks. Then I come out at the end as a much more successful and profitable business, and therefore I am a better investment, and I'm more, you know, I stand out as between my competition. And so I'd like to really say, think about it this way, and use this as an opportunity rather than just something that you have to comply with.
Thanks. I just, when you were speaking, I just about, let's say, the challenge of reporting on risks and what it means for business. I remembered one particular report by EDF, which is a French-based energy giant with, you know, substantial market share in the UK. And correct me if I'm wrong. You have a better overview of the market, I suppose. But they have a very extensive reporting on climate-related risks. And one of the things that really struck me is that they've really looked at the issue of heat waves and what it means for the power plants, even for the thermal power plants, and in terms of investments and insulation and so on and so forth. And they actually have a plan for it, because they already see it and they can actually put a number on it. I mean, this is what physical risks are already costing us. So that was really interesting. And the other interesting point in that report was that they do provide quite detailed information on decarbonization, or on their plan to meet the Paris objectives. But at the same time, they've identified in that report some structural obstacles that really prevent them from doing that. That, you know, that even if they would like to meet those targets, it's just impossible under the current economic conditions. So it was really interesting, because it was a strong signal to investors what's wrong in the system, what prevents them from doing that. So there are, you know, different ways how this can be approached. There was one more thing I wanted to ask you about, and in the CDSB's recommendations, there is a note on, or recommendation, that the companies should assess their business against two scenarios, climate change scenarios. I was wondering if you can give a little bit detail to it. I mean, we don't have that much time, but still, if you can tell the listeners what this is really about.
Sure, and this really comes from the TCIT recommendations as well. So it's a sort of a as our guiding principles almost. But really, what the importance of assessing your business against scenarios is comes back to the same point. It comes back to risk management. We are in uncertain times, and we don't know exactly what will happen in the future, but we have an idea of what might happen to a reasonable amount of certainty. So the idea here is to communicate to your audience about how you might manage the risks that might come up in various potential futures. So the idea is really to look at a 2-degree scenario, which is sort of the one of the sort of temperature rises that are often discussed in climate change negotiations, and another one, be that a higher or a lower scenario. And the higher scenario tells you about sort of riskier situations and how you might manage that, or a lower scenario might be a more optimistic approach, and you might see how you might be part of the solution, and how you might benefit from a better sort of outcome and more climate action now. But really, it's a way again to give some very specificity about the risk management processes that you have, and to show to your readers that you're thinking long term and you are risk averse and you are going through resilience. That's really it. We think about risk. Scenario analysis as a requirement to predict the future. It is not. It is purely a hypothetical. What would you do if that were the case? And that gives your investors a sense of how you're managing risk, and then they can talk to you. Well, we agree. Okay, that's great, but actually we don't agree on this point. Maybe you should think about it more, and you should manage that risk more.
Thank you. I'll now move us all to the very last couple of slides we have prepared, in which we outline what is to come in terms of the regulatory reform, and then we will answer quickly the questions that we have gathered, and we're moving to the end. But now for the plans for the expansion of the scope of the EU non-financial reporting directive on the basis of everything you have said. But before I do that, let me make a note on the enforcement. So the supervision and enforcement of this legislation is done through the national law and through procedurally through the national competent authorities. This all is coordinated at the European level by the European Securities and Markets Authority, which has encouraged in its last let's say report on the enforcement priorities that the national competent authorities do focus on how companies fulfill the requirements of the EU non-financial reporting directive. There's a report on it. We've included the links, so you can then later on click on them when we send you the presentation. And there is already a new public statement on the new enforcement priorities for the next year. This is of course addressed to the national competent authorities. And one more thing that I should add is that in the last year, the ESMA has done a report on the assessment of 145 issuers, which resulted in 29 enforcement actions. And we've read the report, you can read our materials about it, but essentially they applied extremely low bar. So when checking whether a company reported on environmental policy, they tick the box if there was anything. Whether they reported on appropriate KPIs, well, they tick the box if there was any kind of an environmental KPI with no consideration of whether actually that's a meaningful information or connected to the policy. But that's perfectly fine, because this is as much as the national supervisory authorities are allowed by the legislation, which is currently very, very vague. But the reason why we are putting it here is that it indicates that there is an interest at the part of let's say European supervisory authority to drive the enforcement, with the development of the legislation, this will become, let's say, more stringent. So if we can move to the next point, which is really about the reform. Well, everything is on the slide, so I can just read what's up there. But essentially, the political decision has been taken. We are at the end of the public consultation period, and we await a publication of several documents. But most importantly, in September, the Commission will publish an impact assessment with suggested policy options. And if they get the mandate for their preferred policy option, they will present a draft legal text of the new legislation by the end of December, which will replace the EU non-financial reporting directive. Very likely, or quite possibly, it will become a regulation that is a directly applicable piece of legislation, which doesn't need to be transposed through the national law. And simultaneously with that, they will start to develop reporting standards, not dissimilar from financial reporting standards, which will be functionally connected with this legislation. So the legislation should stay principle-based, but much more clear than today. But in addition to that, the companies will see what concrete information they need to disclose if their materiality analysis points them to certain issues or risks or impacts. This is all connected with the similar developments for investors, so namely the disclosure regulation and taxonomy regulation, which will require, starting next year, all financial market participants to report on certain sustainability issues and their due diligence on the share of, let's say, high-risk assets in their portfolios, as well as the share of sustainable activities that contribute to the transition, especially in the climate space. So let's move to the next slide, which is the last slide. We've included here some information on what are the topics of the reform. I mean, nothing is set in stone. We'll know more in autumn, but here are the points that will very likely be addressed because they are being addressed in the public consultation document by the European Commission. So the most important thing and the most relevant thing for I suppose, Visegrad countries and the Czech Republic in particular is the issues of scope. Currently, only large companies with over 500 employees and some connection to the financial market are covered by the legislation. But this 500 employees is an additional political condition which has been added to the legislation. It does not correspond with the definition of large public interest entities in the accounting directive. It's very likely that this will be removed. So any company over 250 employees and meeting certain criteria on the turnover will become subject to the legislation, provided it has a connection to the financial markets. Secondly, all share or bond issuers might fall under the scope of the proposal that will be produced by the European Commission. Not only those actually admitted to the trading. So that's a little bit fuzzy point, but the bond issuers and listed companies already have that obligation, but they want to expand it a little bit more. It's also quite likely, or almost certain, that that the Commission will try to find a way how non-European companies that are raising capital in the EU would fall under the scope of this obligation, which makes sense because it's all about the financial markets and the risks to their stability. Finally, it's quite likely that this obligation will be extended at least to large companies, even if they are private. And this will be the logic being, well, they have major impacts, and B, they have their failure or problems would have major consequences on local communities, in specific countries or at the country level, and this can also endanger the economy. But also, these companies typically have kind of a privileged relationships with local authorities due to their economic importance in the regions, and thus there are a lot of informal accountability mechanisms that this reporting can, help to improve. It's less likely that the obligations will expand to private small and medium enterprises, which consists of, I don't know how many, 99% of Czech companies. So this really concerns only the big companies. The second likely reform is that the information will be probably mandatory to be included in the annual report. Right now, companies have a choice to do it separately or as part of the annual report. Thirdly, the focus of the reform will be on clarifying materiality determination requirements, and as well as disclosure requirements, as well as the content. So this is what reporting is really about. It's up to the companies to say what issues are material for them, and this will be clarified in the legislation. It's also very likely that the issue of reporting on targets will be included in the new legislation. And finally, there is quite a lot of focus in the European Commission's thinking on the disclosures around governance and board engagements, which brings us back to the chicken or the egg problem that we've discussed before. The very last point is one that I've already mentioned, and that the legislation will be accompanied by mandatory standards comprising mostly of the KPIs and due diligence. So KPIs, think of climate change emissions, and whether scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 would be applicable to different kind of industries, and more qualitative criteria for due diligence in high-risk sectors such as garment or sectors using conflict minerals, and so on and so forth. So that's what ahead of us. Actually, if we can perhaps go back to the previous slide, just for the one last look, it's going to happen very, very quickly. This year they will develop it. Next year it will be adopted. The year after, we're reporting. And the reason for this rush is that investors already have the obligation that will kick in 2021, and they can't fulfill these obligations if they don't have the information from companies. So there's no question how this could be in any way slowed down. It's simply happening. Okay, let me close on that note, and let's look quickly at the questions and whether we can answer them. There are 3 questions, which are all in the same vein. So I'll just try to respond to them quickly, and let's see if Mike Zimoni or Ludmila Heiklova would have something to add. So on the first one, and just for the sake of the efficiency, I'll answer those that I can, even though they might better fit others. So there's a question to Mike regarding the picture on the climate environmental related issues and how the report on it is voluntary by now and business stick to voluntary approach. Yeah, I think covered that question. It's simply happening that it's not going to be as voluntary as before. And there's another question to you, Michael, on the evidence that the information provided by companies is not sufficient. And the results of the consultation show that it is too early to assess it, and the NFR remains valid to a large extent. So one thing is the research. I mean, we've seen 1,000 reports, so I can tell you from our experience that we see the results and they're not good. That's one thing. And every single research in this space is pointing out to the very same conclusion. There's no evidence to the contrary. So that's one thing. But that's just the research. And you may argue that, well, the researchers are biased. I mean, who would do this research other than people who would like to see, more clear requirements? But Mike, I was wondering if you can add comments on, let's say, other sources for this conclusion, such as who else other than charities like CDSB or Frankfurt Frankfurt Society is reaching this conclusion. And I don't mean repeating what the Commission said in the public consultation document, but where does this opinion comes from on the other question?
Sure. I mean, the Commission, I would also say, is not a charity and probably would like to stay with things as they are. It's less work for them, so they're not doing it out of the goodness of their hearts. That's for sure. But others, I would say, we do have ongoing conversations with most of those investors on the slide that I've showed, and many other European investors as well, and they are, saying in no uncertain terms, the information we're getting is not good, and also we have huge gaps in the information. So it's coming from the horse's mouth. I wish they were here to tell you themselves, but they're not today, unfortunately. But the market is very obviously saying this. But we're also hearing it from the companies themselves. What's a good example? I mean, in France, companies are very, very vocal, and it's companies in the oil and gas sector, for example, who are speaking up as well, because they are under significant pressure from their investors, and they want to be able to communicate, but they see that the requirements don't allow them to respond to investor demand as well. So I would say there is, of course, a push by certain businesses to keep things as they are. I would argue it is quite energy intensive and money intensive to do this reporting, and it would be more efficient to make sure that we report something that is actually useful, and we invest our efforts into something that is useful. So I would say yes, there is of course pushback, as there is with any sort of strengthening requirements. But I personally don't see the market, and not just the charities, but the actual financial market actors and businesses disagreeing significantly with the fact that we're not there yet, and we're not reaching what the outcomes that we need.
Thank you. And the last question concerns, well, I suppose the present crisis and the plea that companies should be allowed to do their best to survive and not to be regulated more. I suppose that the answer or the reflection to these questions has 2 dimensions. One is the bigger questions concerning Green Deal. In fact, I mean, just to put a label on it, but generally, introducing sustainability-related regulation. The argument there would be, well, if we are making it through this crisis, there is another crisis brewing, a much, much, much bigger one. So we better use the opportunity of this crisis to kind of, set us on the right path. But I don't want to be advocate for that, because that has nothing actually to do with the work we have presented here and with the reform of the EU non-financial reporting directive. I'm just, let's say, parroting the argument which is out there. But the reason why I can kind of do this is that the legislation on reporting that we have discussed today is not about behavior change as such. It may lead to a behavioral change through, improving a better communication flow between the finance markets and companies. But the legislation itself does not require companies to do anything, just to provide certain information, and nothing is really mandatory in that sense. Companies are supposed to report on their risks, and there should be a much clearer guidance on what exactly this should be. But that doesn't mean that they have to adopt a certain strategy. I mean, we have energy companies in the Czech Republic that are betting on coal, on kind of outlasting the competition and fulfill that the need for the base load over the next couple of decades. And they are just really focusing on that. And this legislation does not forbid that. It just requires certain disclosure of certain information that makes this strategy quite transparent in terms of how carefully company assesses the risk, how much bet it is in that. And now this information can be communicated privately between companies and investors, and that's what's happening. But the bigger you get as a company, the more, let's say, financialized you get, the more requests, more investors you get, until you get into quite an absurd situation, such as mostly in France, where there's over a dozen of reporting legislations in place, and yet companies have to deal with more than dozens of requests every year from rating agencies, from individual investors. So they have to actually employ staff just to respond to the questions on their sustainability performance and filling in, these idiosyncratic questionnaires on the social environmental performance. So actually, they see a great value in standardization of all of this and then just streamlining what is the information that actually matters. So it's not as easy as regulation or not regulation. And the non-financial reporting directive objective is to harness the market power to drive the change, not to prescribe companies what they need to do. But to harness the market power, there needs to be a certain information out there. So I hope this answers the concern somewhat. And with that, we are 1 minute before the scheduled end. So let me use that 1 minute to thank you for participating, thank our panelists, and hand over to Mrs. Hikova for any final words that you may have.
Yeah, thank you very much as well for the participating and staying with us for 1 hour, 1 hour and a half. Even it was 1 hour and a half, still it was not enough time to pause all the important information. So I would like to encourage you, if you are interested. I mean, of course, all of you are professional people with the experience, with a lot of experience. But some of the guidances or the guidelines which are available and which were prepared by the OECD are very practical tools. So you can find them on our websites, on Ministry of Industry and Commerce under the national contact point, and you can get inspired by them. So this is the first topic, and the second point is that the responsible business conduct and reporting on that, it's an inevitable trend. Yeah, we will not get rid of this or avoid this. Yeah, so I can understand the point of the companies. So from our side, regulators of the government, it makes the task is to make it, or to push for make it straightforward and understandable, and use already available sources which companies have for the reporting. So not to bring more harness, more burden to the companies, but still we will not be able to avoid that, and it's necessary to something what has to be done. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much. And with this, let's close the webinar. You will receive some materials from us, everything that we have mentioned today, and please do feel free, do feel welcome to reach out to us, to any of us, in case you have further questions or would seek advice on these matters.